Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our next segment, sticking on the offensive side of the football with our Offensive Player of the Year betting odds, I do want to remind you yet again that if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. It is greatly appreciated by all involved, especially me, my fellow podcasters, and ultimately the network. So anything you leave is greatly appreciated. But without further ado, let us jump right into our second segment of today's show and stick on the offensive side of the football with our Offensive Player of the Year awards. I like the variation amongst this year's candidates. Still a lot of heavy favorites involved here, but there are guys who kind of are make or break years, kind of in years where we want to see improvement from them in offenses that have somewhat failed to include them, and others coming back from injury who just want to establish themselves yet again as some of the better offensive players in the league. And I really like that most of these guys are wide receivers instead of, just running backs, because right now the running back market is very complicated, as we all know. So I appreciate that aspect of it. Without further ado, let's jump right into it. Starting off with two guys kind of at the bottom of this list, both who've had very different starts to their careers. One more frustrating, the other a little bit more hopeful, but he hasn't really smelled success very often. Those are Bijan Robinson at plus 2,000, Justin Jefferson at plus 1,500. So Bijan Robinson actually gets Justin Jefferson's former quarterback now in his system. Is probably the best quarterback he's ever had, but as a running back, he just wants more touches. That was his problem last year, as Arthur Smith kind of held him back a little bit. Still had a pretty good season, over 900 yards, about 7 or 8 touchdowns. That's always solid. But I felt like he wasn't employed in the way that he can. And as a former Texas player and a player who I've saw very often as a Texas fan, I feel like the best way to exploit Bijan Robinson is get him in space. And I hope Raheem Morris understands that and uses him a lot more, gets him in space, gets him on the outside, allows him to make the moves and cuts that he's known for, and also allow him to break free of this hold that Arthur Smith had over him for quite some time. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, Justin Jefferson has had a lot of success in his NFL career, but this year is very different. At plus 1,500, I think his odds are much lower because Kirk is gone. In steps either Sam Darnold or J.J. McCarthy. I think it will be Sam Darnold to start off the year, and J.J. McCarthy might be worked in a little bit as the year goes on. Now, Justin Jefferson has always had Kirk Cousins, who always relied upon him as his wide receiver one, and now, who knows? Sam Darnold and J.J. McCarthy might struggle. The Vikings are definitely looking like they're not in a good spot quarterback-wise in order for the best wide receiver to be happy. Justin Jefferson has always been Kirk Cousins' wide receiver one. It's never in doubt. Obviously, he's had a lot of injuries. Watching receiver kind of, put it into perspective, all the injuries Justin Jefferson had to go through last year, and he really wants this year to be special for him. But it's just a case of getting back to that level of consistency himself, whilst also hoping that his quarterbacks can realize him as that receiver we know he is. And so, both of these guys, not necessarily make or break years, but years where they want to get to where they need to be. Bijan more so than Justin Jefferson, because Justin Jefferson, like I said, has already had so many fantastic seasons. Both of these guys know their potential. And then we move on to guys like Jamar Chase and CeeDee Lamb at plus 1,100 and plus 1,000 respectively, who are in very interesting situations in terms of their wide receiver rooms. Jamar Chase, obviously, has always been the number one receiver in Cincinnati. Him and Joe Burrow coming out of LSU together, that connection has always remained. But this year definitely feels weird, mainly due to the rumblings about T. Higgins' contract. Maybe Joe Burrow will want to feed T. Higgins a little bit more. Not to say that Jamar Chase's production will go down, because he's always going to get his production by hook or by crook. But this year it feels a little bit weird and tense in that Cincinnati Bengals wide receiver room. And it might be the reason why he's not a little bit higher on this list. I think that he could challenge the top receiver on this list. And then you look at CeeDee Lamb at plus 1,000, who's also kind of in a weird situation where he is also the number one wide receiver in the Dallas Cowboys wide receiver room, but it's kind of by default. I mean, you have an aging Brandon Cooks who might still have a couple good years in him, but is a little bit fishy. And then you have Jake Ferguson, who's more of a red zone kind of tight end and more of a blocking tight end, who occasionally makes himself present in the red zone. And so CeeDee Lamb definitely should have higher or better odds than Jamar Chase, but overall I feel like these two guys are in a weird kind of situation of wide receiver purgatory where their teams aren't necessarily, in the best spot, position-wise. And so I kind of feel like they're anomalous in that they are the number one receivers on their team, but there just feels like a sense of emptiness around them, They definitely are going to have the production that is needed to win a Player of the Year award like this, but I think it's kind of a hindrance to their own development if their other wide receivers are not up to par. And then let's look at the top of the list. Tyreek Hill at plus 750. And of course, CMC tied with him at plus 750. Now Tyreek Hill, as we all know, has two things going for him. One is that it's a very competitive market in terms of Dolphins wide receivers. There's a solid wide receiver too in Jalen Waddle. And two is that his speed and separation really elevates his QB in Tua. If, Tyreek Hill was more of a route runner and could be jammed a little bit more, it would have been harder to kind of put him above other wide receivers. But his speed just allows Tua to just put the ball on the plate for him and he can just explode. And that's why, he has as much yardage as he does. I think he could be close to 2,000 yards receiving this year. I said it. And when all is said and done, he's the wide receiver right now who looks like he's going to have the stats, the touchdowns to back up his case for Offensive Player of the Year. And, when I talk about all these wide receiver rooms for these different guys, and look at the Dolphins, they're kind of predicated on something. They know what they're going to be. They know their identity. And I really don't think the Bengals and Cowboys really do right now. They're in weird places where certain receivers may be unhappy, maybe holding out for money, and they're not in a good situation. So that makes their wide receiver situation more muddled than the Miami Dolphins, who know their guys are going to produce. And that makes Tyreek Hill the top receiver on this list. But I don't necessarily think he's going to be the top dog when all is said and done in terms of this award, because there's a little guy named Christian McCaffrey playing for the San Francisco 49ers who's just that good. And when I think about Christian McCaffrey, I think about a player who just focuses on doing what is necessary for the team. Whatever you need him to do, he's always going to be there. He doesn't even need to score a touchdown for his importance to show through for the San Francisco 49ers. That what makes him so special. And a team that just has so many different weapons. Deebo Samuel, if Brandon Ayuk stays, then him. George Kittle, Brock Purdy, even though a lot of people have criticized him, myself included, for being a system kind of guy, he still can distribute the wealth. And just having a guy in Christian McCaffrey at the running back position, no less, who doesn't necessarily often play like he's a running back, just makes this offense so explosive. Because worrying about Deebo Samuel and George Kittle as receivers is one thing. Worrying about Christian McCaffrey gashing you up the middle is quite another. And when you add the fact that he's a solid blocker, he can receive as well and can throw, as we saw, it just allows the playbook to open up for him wherever the 49ers are on the field. In the red zone, in the open field, even in the opposing team's territory. Christian McCaffrey is always going to be lethal. And looking at this list, Christian McCaffrey has one thing over everyone else on this list. He's on the best team. He's on the best team of anyone on this list. There's a lot of wishful thinking with a lot of these teams. I talk about the Falcons. They're a team of wishful thinking. A lot of expectations are placed on their shoulders, especially on Bijan Robinson's shoulders. So who knows if they'll collapse under the pressure. The Vikings, in a kind of a transitional period. Justin Jefferson may not get as many targets. Who knows? The quarterbacks might struggle in that situation. Jamar Chase, his quarterback is coming back from an injury, and his wide receiver 2 is kind of holding out a little bit. The Cowboys, they're a good offense, but they don't have anyone outside of CeeDee Lamb, so that puts a lot of pressure on him to be above and beyond every other receiver in the league. And then we look at Tyreek Hill. Yeah, he has speed, but he's the one who's elevating to at the end of the day. And should opposing defenses just play two high safeties, let's say, and try and combat his speed, then that renders everything a moot point. And so, at the end of the day, this definitely looks like a very clear path for Christian McCaffrey to win this award, just because of the ability for this 49ers playbook to really open up for him should they be clicking. When they have momentum, Christian McCaffrey is kind of the centerpiece and focal point of what they can do with this offense. And that's why I believe he should be everyone's choice for Offensive Player of the Year. But that should just about do it for this segment. Coming next, we switch to the defensive side of the football. We look at our Defensive Player of the Year candidate. Should be a good segment for you guys. I'll be right back on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it?